From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. It's not often that you wake up, turn on the radio to catch up on the news, and then stop. Because what you're hearing is a direct threat to you and your family.
Little friends, Britain and United States made very big step to the nuclear war and catastrophic destroying all human mind. All of yours will be killed probably end of this year, and your families will be killed and so on.
That extraordinary intervention came from a man named Sergei Markov, a former advisor to President Putin, who was on Times Radio warning of an apocalyptic nuclear showdown coming soon.
This situation can move to the nuclear catastrophe already this year. This year, before the Christmas, probably if Putin will have the same policy as Biden, it can come to the nuclear catastrophe before the Christmas days.
Right. President Biden's decision to allow American missiles to be used to attack Russia had already caused fury in the Kremlin, but a lot of Russia's anger seemed to be reserved for the UK.
Perhaps Joe Biden, for many reasons, has nothing left to lose, but we're astounded by the short-sightedness of the leadership of UK and France. They are eager to play into the hands of the exiting administration and are dragging not just their countries, but the entire Europe into large-scale escalation with drastic consequences.
If that wasn't alarming enough, the Kremlin upped the ante again by changing the rules and declaring that any kind of attack against Russia could now trigger a nuclear response. That didn't stop Britain allowing Storm Shadow missiles to be used on Russian soil.
There's irresponsible rhetoric coming from Russia, and that is not going to deter our support for Ukraine. I've been doubling down in my clear message that we need to ensure that Ukraine has what is needed for as long as is needed to win this war against Putin.
With tensions ratcheting up, Russia launched their first intercontinental ballistic missile against Ukraine, a major escalation. So what happens next? Should we be preparing for a Russian attack? The story today: Putin's nuclear threat.
I'm Edward Lucas. I've spent 40 years dealing with the Kremlin, both in its Soviet and more lately Russian incarnations. I'm a Times columnist, and I also work for a think tank in Washington.
Edward, as someone who has watched Russia so closely for decades now, just describe the reaction over the last few days since we heard about President Biden's decision. How are Russian media talking about it?
I think this comes in the category of performative hysterics. They are claiming that we have done something absolutely outrageous and they're therefore justified in doing anything they like in return. This is the usual Russian reaction to anything that the outside world does that they don't like, a sort of fake outrage. I do think we're in a very dangerous position, but that's largely because we failed to be firmer earlier when we would have had more credibility.
You've described how the Russian media are responding, as you say, with histrionics, but what about the Kremlin? We hear now that they've changed their nuclear doctrine in response to America's decision to allow missiles to be used on Russian soil. Tell us about that. What should we make of it?
Well, Russia has changed its nuclear doctrine over the years from saying that it would only use nuclear weapons in extremis in response to a nuclear attack. They would never be the first to use nuclear weapons, through to a much broader trigger or category of reasons that they would justify a nuclear response with, where if they think Russia's existential interests are threatened. And they've now broadened that to say that if Russia is attacked by a country that doesn't have nuclear weapons, but with the support of a country that does, then they might have a nuclear response. But all this is basically play acting. It's all part of their psychological warfare against the West to try and spook us, and it's working. And the big lesson of this war is that nuclear blackmail works. If Ukraine hadn't given up its nuclear weapons after 1994, it wouldn't have been attacked. And if we weren't scared of Russian nuclear weapons, we would have given Ukraine all the money and all the weapons that it needed in order to win.
There have been a number of quite overt threats since the war in Ukraine broke out from the Russians, threatening a nuclear apocalypse, really. As a result, how seriously should we be taking those threats now?
Well, I think the longer we dither and the weaker we appear, in a way, the less of a red line there is for the Russians in attacking us some way or another. So I think we have now seen systematic Russian attacks on NATO countries in the so-called sub-threshold world. We have airspace intrusions, we have sabotage of infrastructure, assassinations, and all sorts of other things. And I think it's now possible that Russia will attack maybe a base in a NATO country to signal how displeased they are with this. Whether they would actually go nuclear, I think, is much less likely, not least because the Chinese have made it very clear that they would strongly disapprove of that. China has a very austere nuclear doctrine that nuclear weapons are only used to deter the use of other nuclear weapons, and they don't like this kind of saber rattling from Putin, and I think they would like it even less if he actually took the saber out of its scabbard and started trying to use it.
Even if they don't go nuclear, if they were to attack a NATO country, as you said they might, isn't that war?
Well, this is what really bothers me, is that I think there's a kind of grey zone between what the country that was attacked would regard as an act of war and what NATO would actually be willing to respond to. So if you had, for example, an attack on Poland or one of the Baltic states, perhaps hard to attribute a mysterious big explosion or the assassination of some political or business leaders or some other kind of sabotage, the country concerned might think that's it, we need now to strike back on Russia. And I'm not sure that NATO, as it currently is, would agree to that. They might say this is a limited attack and needs only a limited response or even a non-military response. So you might be in a position where NATO countries in the east of NATO are wanting to go to war, ready to go to war, wanting to strike inside Russia. And the NATO commanders are saying no, because Germany doesn't like this and the Americans don't like this and other NATO countries don't like it. So Putin has identified the weakest spot in NATO, which is our decision-making.
And on that question of decision-making, this latest decision to allow the use of long-range missiles by Ukraine on Russian soil comes from President Biden when just 2 months ago he was refusing to do exactly that. For him and for a lot of the caution of his administration to try and make sense of that, do we really have to look back to the Cold War, which is the backdrop of much of his life in particular? Just describe how the relationship between Russia and the West was calibrated. How did the theory of deterrence work?
First of all, can I implore you not to call these long-range missiles? They're not. They're short to medium-range missiles. They are precision missiles, which, had they been given to Ukraine earlier, could have done a lot of damage to concentrations of forces and logistics points and airfields and so on that would have been within range. With regard to deterrence, anyone who remembers the Cold War, as I do, being a lot older than you, remembers the idea of the balance of terror. And that this did basically keep the peace through the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s, but with some very hairy moments. There was great room for misunderstanding, and the idea of the disabling first strike from the other side, which could knock you out completely, meant that you had then to be on a sort of hair trigger so as to launch your missiles before your silos were hit. And we spent a lot of time in the Cold War trying to work out a sort of deterrence theory where everybody was able to defend themselves adequately and didn't have to worry about the sort of so-called first strike knockout.
The Soviet Union now has the ability to deliver a nuclear warhead within 600 feet of a Minuteman silo. It is this accuracy, combined with the destructive power of the thousands of nuclear warheads in the Soviet arsenal, that has made our land-based missiles vulnerable. Each missile would have 23 shelters, between which the missile would be periodically shuttled. Because of the uncertainty as to which shelter contained the missile, all 23 would have to be attacked to be sure of destroying one missile.
And that did make things quite a lot safer towards the end, although not perfectly. But I think we're in a very different world now. The kind of war we are facing is not a nuclear standoff between two broadly matched nuclear superpowers. It's a colonial war being waged by Russia against what's basically a Western protectorate, but we're scared of protecting it. I think that the Joe Biden of the 80s and 90s and noughties, and even up to a few years ago, the man I remember, would have been much more robust in standing up to Russia. But I'm afraid in his near dotage, he's become obsessed with the idea of not having escalation, that he doesn't want a nuclear confrontation with Russia on his watch. And that filters down from the very top in the White House.
Just talk us through how close things came at moments during the 80s and the sort of things that Joe Biden now might be thinking back on.
Yes, I mean, it's worth remembering we did confront the Soviet Union very hard during the Cold War, sometimes by backing absolutely appalling regimes who were facing communist insurrections. We poured money into Afghanistan, for example, to help the forefathers of the Taliban, the Mujahideen, against the Soviet-backed regime in Kabul.
These are the Mujahideen, the fighters of the Jihad, the Muslim holy war. They are men of faith, of Islam. Even now, what they talk of is going back to Afghanistan to kill Russians and of getting more American weapons to help do that. The rifles and rocket launchers are Russian designed, but they're paid for by the United States and by Saudi Arabia. The CIA claims it's spending $75 million a year on the war.
And so we weren't at all afraid of having very vigorous confrontations, but we knew that those confrontations would stay at the conventional threshold. And I think that's actually the attitude that we should take in Ukraine now. There were a number of terrifying standoffs. There was one point during the Cuban Missile Crisis where a Soviet submarine came very close to launching its nuclear weapons. There was the Able Archer exercise in 1983 when we were having what we thought was a regular NATO exercise, but the paranoid gerontocratic leadership in the Kremlin thought this was a precedent to a devastating first strike against the Soviet Union. There was another case when a missile warning system malfunctioned and allegedly the engineer on duty just decided the machine was on the blink and didn't call the Kremlin. So I certainly don't look back on this with any great sense of calm satisfaction, but I think that we've been duped by the memories of the Cold War into behaving in a way that we would never have behaved during the Cold War.
That's so interesting. And now that President Biden has changed his mind just 2 months later, do we know why? What do you think has changed the calculation for him?
Russia has systematically escalated over the years. And obviously the attack on Ukraine at the beginning was a big escalation. Striking civilian targets was an escalation. The attacks on infrastructure was an escalation. Blocking the grain exports, which had a ripple effect all over the world, was an escalation. The sub-threshold attacks on other NATO countries and sabotage and so on, that's been an escalation. And now the use of Iranian drones is an escalation, and the use of North Korean soldiers is an escalation. I think this is certainly a striking thing that we have 10,000 North Koreans coming and probably many more tens of thousands on their way. And you might well see some Revolutionary Guards turning up, or even some of the PLA at some point, the way things are going. So there's a kind of path to a much wider presence on the battlefield, and I think that's probably crossed some sort of red line for Biden.
How much do you think this decision, because we started hearing about North Koreans being deployed a little while ago, how much of this do you think is down to Trump and his victory?
I think that the Biden-Harris administration has actually been awful. And I've spoken to many people in Eastern Europe who say we are on a slide to disaster. And if there's only a 10% chance of Trump actually turning out to be okay, that's still better than a sort of 99% certainty that Harris won't be. We tend to catastrophize about Trump with good reason. Clearly, some of the rhetoric coming out from his camp is a sort of vindictive anti-Ukrainian rhetoric, and there's also a sort of vindictive anti-European streak there. But there are other strands of decision-making as well, and Trump doesn't like to be seen weak. So I can see some sort of deal emerging. The simple idea that Trump will throw Ukraine under the bus and there's nothing we can do about it, I think is too simplistic.
Edward, as a close Russia watcher, just describe the state that Russia is in now. You know, we know that sanctions kicked in a while ago, and yet the economy seemed to be booming at first. What are things like now?
Russia's always had terrible long-term problems, going right back to the moment it emerged from the Soviet Union. So the demographics are terrible, the infrastructure is bad, the health is awful, there's terrible corruption, the institutions are weak. And yet, despite that, it ploughs on. Russian decision makers are willing to use resources in a way that no Western leader would. They throw human beings into the meat grinder, they're willing to degrade the economy, they're willing to sacrifice the future for the present. And there's always a huge dose of wishful thinking when we look at Russia. We think this can't continue, so therefore it won't. And actually, it jolly well does, and it's to the detriment of the Russian people in the long run and to the enormous detriment of the Ukrainians right now. They have evaded our sanctions. They've been quite ineffective, as can be seen from the fact that Russia is still waging its war with great gusto.
But is their economy really starting to show the cracks now? I mean, I think inflation is up to 9%. Interest rates, which, you know, people think are crippling here, are at more than 20%.
I mean, there is all sorts of signs of stress. You've mentioned the interest rates. There's also the labour market, which is extremely tight. But in the end, it's a war economy. People are willing to make sacrifices and they can print money, they can borrow money. The thing that would really crash them, I think, would be if oil went down to sort of $40, $50 a barrel. And then that would impose some real difficulties. But so long as the oil price stays high and they can dodge the sanctions, they've got enough money to keep going. At the moment, I don't think they see anything that's in their way from keeping this war going for at least another year. And they think they'll have broken Ukraine and they will have shown that their willpower outlasted ours and they will be vindicated. It'll be game over for Ukraine and I fear quite soon also game over for us.
Given the stresses on the Russian system right now, will these attacks by American missiles, will they be seen domestically as a sign of weakness? I mean, does President Putin have to be seen to be doing something about them because there's so much else that isn't working?
We always overestimate this. We think, oh my goodness, the Russians will be revolted by the level of casualties. They will be humiliated by the incursion of the Ukrainians into Kursk. They'll be spooked by the fact that Ukrainian-made drones are landing on airfields in the north of Russia, or Western-made rockets are landing on their munition dumps or whatever. And this is all wrong. It's partly that Kremlin has a tremendous grip on the media, so it tells the story the way it wants. And also that this fits neatly into their narrative of the world's against us. We are at war with the West because the West's at war with us. Now, they said that even when it wasn't true. And anything that we do that fits into that, they will happily use. There's an enormous dose of sort of magical wishful thinking where we think because we want something to happen, it will. And the idea that the Ukrainian precision strikes are either a military game changer in terms of helping Ukraine or a political game changer in terms of changing public opinion in Russia fall into that category. Ain't going to happen.
And going back to the Cold War, so much of the relationship between Russia and the West, it's been this sort of taut balancing act. Do you think that's now irretrievably broken? It does feel like the power has shifted to Russia to set the red lines and the rest of the world is following.
I think we've been getting Russia catastrophically wrong since the early 1990s. And we were warned right back then, pre-Putin, about the danger of Russian Soviet nostalgia and imperial nostalgia. And this was a danger even then for neighbouring countries, and it was going to be a danger for the rest of Europe sooner or later. And we systematically ignored those warnings because we were ignorant and naive and complacent and stubborn and most of all, I would say, greedy. And now it's come back to bite us. If there is now a more sober awareness of the existential threat we face from Russia with its designs on its European neighbours, that's all to the good. But I fear that the Ukrainians, through enormous sacrifice over the last 3 years, brought us some time. And we've wasted it. We've wasted it in that we failed to help them win, and they may now lose. But also we are now heading for a much wider war for which we are absolutely not ready, and our own safety and freedom are directly at risk as a result.
If you're enjoying this episode of The Story, you can listen to more by subscribing to the podcast. It's completely free, and we'll put a link below in the description box for different ways you can follow us.
I am Ben Hodges, U.S. Army Lieutenant General, retired. My last duty was as Commanding General of U.S. Army in Europe.
And in that role, how much of the job is spent watching the Russians and assessing the risk they pose?
The time that I was the Commanding General of U.S. Army Europe was from November of 2014 up through December of 2017. Russian activities, preparations, their status, that was a full-time occupation for us. That was the main threat. You know, they had already invaded Ukraine in 2014 when I became the commander. So we obviously paid a lot of attention to what they were doing.
I bet. We've seen a change of policy from America over the last few days. President Biden is now allowing long-range missiles, ATACMS, to be used by the Ukrainians on Russian soil. Just give us a sense of what these weapons can do and how the Ukrainians will be using them.
So the particular ATACMS in question has a range of a little over 300 kilometers. At least that's the unclassified range of this weapon. It is a precise long-range strike capability that is ideal for taking out headquarters or logistics sites, ammunition storage, for example, exactly like what we saw in Bryansk. I would anticipate that Ukrainians would use these weapons for those purposes because that's how you can undermine the only advantage the Russians have, which is their large mass formations. Take away headquarters, take away their artillery, take away the logistics. That's where I anticipate they'll be most effective.
And the focus has now shifted to Keir-Starmer and the use of British Storm Shadow missiles. How much of a difference can they make?
Well, again, the Storm Shadow is an excellent weapon. We saw it in use in Sevastopol. You'll remember about a year and a half ago when they destroyed the Russian Black Sea Fleet headquarters there. So a very effective weapon. I think that the Ukrainians would use these for similar type targets, either logistics and headquarters or any of the locations from which Russia is attacking. But I'm afraid, I've tried to figure out if this is true or not, but the reporting that I see says that actually it's the United States that has blocked UK from delivering Storm Shadow to be used inside Russia. I don't know that that's true. It certainly would be very frustrating and discouraging if it is true.
Would you be surprised?
Unfortunately, no. You know, the Biden administration has done a good job on many aspects of support for Ukraine, but they have failed the critical task, which is to clearly identify the strategic objective. Why are we supporting Ukraine? Why is this important for us in the U.S., in the West? And if you don't have a clear objective, it's very difficult to have good, clear, effective policy. And so that's why we end up with these goofy policies of here you can have ATACMS, but you can't use them against certain targets. You can't defend yourself. And I attribute this to the fact that the Biden administration has an excessive fear that Russia might somehow escalate. And of course, the Russians see that. That's why they'll trot out every week or two, we're changing our nuclear doctrine, et cetera, et cetera.
Again, we've already seen the Russian response has been furious. They are ratcheting up the threat of nuclear war. They've changed their doctrine, as you say. Should we be worried about that? As somebody who's watched them closely for such a long time, what did you make of that move?
I make of this as a continuation of their use of scaremongering, disinformation, because they see that we in the West are vulnerable to this. Look, I think that, of course, you have to take it serious. They have thousands of nuclear warheads. They don't care how many innocent people they kill, including their own. So you have to ask, why would they actually use a nuclear weapon? As I look at it, there's no benefit for them to actually use a tactical nuclear weapon. It won't change anything on the battlefield because, unlike in the Cold War days, when that was the Soviet army, the Russian army does not possess the trained and properly equipped capability to exploit whatever situation would occur on the battlefield after the employment of a tactical nuclear weapon. There's nobody there that can operate in a radioactive environment and exploit that. Secondly, China and India have both told the Russians, do not use nuclear weapons. This is not a moral thing for them, but they don't want any disruption of their access to cheap Russian oil and gas. And so why would they do it? What do they get from it? And there are only downsides for them. It's the threat that they might do it is where they get their biggest benefit.
If they were to do something, I mean, you know, on Russian state TV, we've seen all sorts of options being discussed. So, the threat of nuking Britain, the threat of a tactical nuclear weapon in Ukraine. Do you think we might see them trying to attack countries in Europe in any way? I mean, I understand it may not be nuclear. What should we be watching out for?
Manveen, I think we should be in the mindset that the Russians are already at war with us, not in the traditional kinetic sense. But the Russians don't look at us through the lens of at war, not at war. This is for them constant use of everything that they have, from criminal activity, disinformation, threats, to demonstrations of military capability, violating airspace, violating freedom of navigation. Of course, you know, this week out in the Baltic Sea, undersea cables have been cut. Even the Germans are having to say, okay, nobody on the planet believes this was an accident. So this is the kind of thing that goes on. We've had examples of Russian cruise missiles flying through Romanian airspace, Polish airspace, Latvia. And until we get in the mindset that not only are these unacceptable activities, but we're going to do something about it, then they're going to just keep doing it. So no, they're not going to launch a missile against London or something like that. They are not going to launch something that is obviously an armed attack against a NATO country, because I think they still are pretty certain that most of NATO would respond in a way that would be catastrophic for Russia. But they are constantly pushing the limits of that. And I think our leaders need to talk to us as adults and say, look, this is what's at stake. This is what's at risk. This is what we're going to do about it.
Are you alarmed by how quickly things seem to be escalating? You know, are we moving closer and closer to what people are calling World War III? You know, have you known a time as dangerous as this?
Actually, I don't see us that are moving rapidly towards World War III. That's what the Russians want us to think. What's escalating is their talk about it, because they see how vulnerable we are in our open Western societies. And of course, they're looking at the U.S., where we're about 2 months away from a transition of power to the Trump administration. So they're exploiting that kind of seam, if you will, on our side. But I don't think that we're any closer to the war expanding than we were 2 years ago. What has prolonged this conflict was the lack of decisiveness by the West. From the very beginning, I think the Russians really did believe, they thought they were going to be done in a few days. That really was a special military operation for them. And President Biden deserves so much credit, along with British, French, German, other leaders who said, no, this is not acceptable. But we stopped short of being decisive about the outcome. And so now if you talk to anybody in the Biden administration, you say, what's the objective? What are we doing? They would tell you, well, we want Russia to lose, and we want to avoid escalation, and we want Ukraine to have a good negotiating position. What a empty bottle that is. Why are we not saying what's at stake here? This is not about Ukraine. This is about stability and security for all of Europe, sovereignty, borders, international agreements, freedom of navigation, things that affect our life, that affect our economies. That's what's at stake.
And that indecisiveness, you know, President Biden refused to allow these missiles to be used just 2 months ago. He's now changed his mind. How much has that cost the war in Ukraine? I mean, is there any chance that this is in any way decisive at this point, or have they just left it too late?
There is no one weapon or vehicle or platform that is decisive in and of itself, unless it comes in massive numbers. And clearly that's not happening here. This is better. It will allow Ukraine to degrade or undermine Russia's only advantage of mass by destroying headquarters and logistics, but it's not going to be decisive. What would have been a game changer would have been 2 years ago if the President of the United States and the British Prime Minister had said, it is our strategic objective that Russia is defeated and that Ukraine is able to reestablish sovereignty over its internationally recognized 1991 borders. And we're going to give them everything they need to do that. Instead of this namby-pamby, we're with you for as long as it takes, which means nothing, of course, and nobody believes it anyway. I mean, the war could have been over last year if we had been committed to it. I would still say that Russia, their economy right now is in deep trouble. What they have done is propped up by a lot of artificial structures that are not sustainable. They're having to import ammunition from North Korea, for God's sake. They fear the public reaction if you have a bunch of funerals in Moscow and St. Petersburg, so they are avoiding drafting men from those two metropolitan areas, and they're now going to be depending on North Korean troops to help fill the requirement for mass. So I think Russia actually is in trouble, and right now is the wrong time for us to take our foot off the gas.
That was the former commander of the US Army in Europe, Lieutenant General Ben Hodges. And we also heard from our very own Kremlin watcher and Times columnist, Edward Lucas. You can find all the latest on Russia and Western missiles at thetimes.com and with updates on Times Radio. The producer today was Chris Wade, the executive producer was Kate Ford, and sound design and theme composition were by Mao Lassetto. If you can, please do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. We do read all of them. And if you want to get in touch, do drop us a line at thestory@thetimes.com. Thanks for listening. See you again soon.